Hello, Earth Science peeps. We are heading into our last lecture of the unit. So let's jump on in. This is all about Earth Science. So we're in this class, but what exactly is Earth Science? It's basically just the study of the Earth and all of its parts, like the atmosphere, the soil, the water, all that stuff. There's 5 major areas of study within Earth Science, and we're going to focus on all of them in a little bit of detail throughout the year. These 5 major areas are geology, oceanography, meteorology, astronomy, and environmental sciences. So first, what's geology? It's the field that studies the parts of the Earth that we would consider rocks. So it focuses on things like what are the materials that make up the Earth? How did they form? How do we get all the structures that we see? What are the processes that have formed and changed the planets? So the history of the planet itself. And the goal of studying all of this is to predict future changes in the planet. That's really one of the goals of science in general, but in particular, how is the Earth itself going to change over time? So you probably know these types of scientists pretty well. They're the stereotypical scientists that you think of when you think of an earth scientist, like a geologist, someone who studies fossils, like a paleontologist, someone who studies plate tectonics and volcanoes. All of that is under geology. The second part is oceanography. So this field studies the living and non-living aspects of the ocean, and the ocean is what we only consider salt water. So anything that's fresh water would not be considered part of oceanography studies. So these scientists might focus on things like the chemicals in the ocean, what affects the organisms, how does the water move throughout the world, because remember, all of the oceans are interconnected. They're all part of one major body of water. Now, there's a lot of different types of oceanographers. You could be like a physical oceanographer that mainly studies the physical makeup of the ocean and its chemistry. You could be a marine geologist where you're studying the ocean floor and the thermal vents there, or the volcanoes underneath the ocean, things like that. So this is an important field of study because it's probably the biggest. The oceans cover over 75% of Earth's surface. That is quite a lot of water when you really think about it. So we're going to learn all about what these types of scientists study later in the year. Another aspect of Earth science is meteorology. This one is one that you're all familiar with, but you may not know it. Another word for a meteorologist is a weatherman or a weatherwoman. Meteorologists study natural disasters, weather and wind patterns, but they also study climate. So how has the weather patterns of the Earth changed over time? Mainly what they're studying is the atmosphere and all of the forces that cause the atmosphere to change and to produce weather. Another field is astronomy. This one is, to be honest, the one that I'm looking forward to the most to teach you this year. It's the study of planets and other objects beyond Earth, everything that's out in space. So they focus on the universe, galaxies, planets, black holes, all that stuff. The one thing about astronomy is it's very different from the others. It's a very math-focused field. There's a lot of math and calculations when you do it on a professional level. 2 subfields that you've probably heard of within astronomy are things like astrophysics and planetary science. So we'll learn all about that later in the year. The last field is something called environmental science, and this one is kind of a blend of a couple different things. It could almost be considered a field within biology because you're studying the living things and how they interact with their environment. In biology, we call that ecology. But the way it differs is these types of scientists want to focus on things like the effects of pollution, What are our natural resources on the planet, and how can we find alternative energy sources? So they're looking at both positive and negative interactions between the living things and their environment and their surroundings. Now, while we're studying all of this, you have to understand that the Earth is made up of 4 main systems. Each of them is separate and it has its own processes and its own rules that it follows, and yet they can all interact with each other. They all do interact with each other all the time. Now, you'll find the word sphere in every single system, and that's because we're dealing with the Earth as a whole, and the Earth is a sphere, it's a ball. So we're going to have the geosphere, geo meaning Earth, and sphere referring to the Earth itself. So this is like your rock. Another term for this one is lithosphere, which means rock or stone. You also have atmosphere. That's one of our 4 main systems, all the gases on the planet. The hydrosphere, hydro meaning water. And biosphere, from the word bio meaning life. So let's talk about each of these in a little more detail now. The first is the geosphere. This is probably the thing you think of when I say earth science, when you're like, well, we're studying the earth, so we want to study the soil and the rocks and the core and all of that stuff. So this covers the area from the surface of the earth to its core in the center of the planet. And we divide the geosphere into 3 main parts: the crust, the mantle, and the core. You've probably heard of these terms before, so hopefully this is a good review. So the crust is just the surface or the outer shell of the Earth. This is where all life is. All life lives on the crust of the Earth. So where we're living and walking right now is considered the crust. It's very thin compared to the rest of the Earth. Just underneath the crust is something called the mantle. It's made up of different materials than the crust, and it's also much, much hotter. Inside the mantle is the core. It's mostly made of molten or melted iron, and it is the hottest part of the Earth, located right in the center. You'll often see it divided into an inner core and outer core, but we'll get into that later in another unit. You don't need to know that part here. Just know that the core is the center of the Earth. The next part is the atmosphere. So this is everything above the crust of the Earth. So the geosphere dealt with the crust and below. Now we're dealing with all of the gases that act as a blanket around the Earth. They separate us from space, and they protect us from harmful things that come from space, like the radiation from the sun. They keep our planet at a stable temperature. Without them, either we'd be too hot or too cold to sustain life. And it provides the oxygen and carbon dioxide for all living things on Earth. When we talk about the atmosphere overall, it's about 78% nitrogen. And this isn't a form that we really don't use. It's not in a form that we breathe and take into our bodies. There's other ways that we have to get the nitrogen that we need, especially for plants. We use things like fertilizers. So we'll learn about the nitrogen cycle later in the year as well. The rest of the atmosphere is 21% oxygen, which you know we need to survive, and so same with all the animals. But there's 1% left, and that's things like carbon dioxide, water vapor, argon, and a bunch of other what we call trace gases, because they're in such small amounts. There's also the hydrosphere. So this is all of the water on Earth, even the water that's contained in the atmosphere as well. Things like rain, precipitation. So sometimes they will take the water on Earth that's permanently frozen, like the glaciers, and they'll separate it and call it its own sphere called the cryosphere. But really we're talking all about water still, so it's all still part of the hydrosphere. Now, something interesting is that 97% of all the water on the Earth is in saltwater form. Only 3% is fresh water. So that means all the water that we use to drink, all the water that every living thing uses to live, is only 3% of the water on Earth. We can find it in rivers and streams. We can find it in the water vapor in the atmosphere. We can also find it in what's called groundwater. This is water that has seeped under the ground, and it's located in different caverns or areas there. And the last sphere is the biosphere. So this is all the organisms on the earth, all the living things, and how they interact with their environment. So this even includes plants. It's not just animals. Know that every organism interacts with all the other spheres in some way. Think about the hydrosphere. Well, every organism needs water to survive, so it needs to interact with the hydrosphere. What about the geosphere or the lithosphere? Well, we all live on the crust. Some animals even live within the crust. And we all are breathing or using or living in the atmosphere in some way or another. The main focus of the biosphere, because you might be thinking, well, how is this earth science and not biology? Well, the main focus is in how everything is interacting and how it's interacting with the earth long term. So that is all that I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions, please write them down and come to class with them and we'll go over it. Talk to you later.